What if humans were created twice by the Anunnaki, and the first was erased? The room is kept cool on purpose, not cold enough to sting, just cool enough that the air feels dry when you breathe in, as if moisture is a thing that has been carefully rationed. Behind glass and locked doors, under stable light, there is a piece of baked clay no thicker than a finger. It is broken, incomplete, and yet it carries a dense, disciplined order, 6 columns of cuneiform, 3 on each side, pressed into a surface that was once soft enough to take a fingerprint. The Penn Museum in Philadelphia catalogues it as the Flood Tablet CBS 10673 from Nippur, dated to around 1650 BC by its script, and described as the lower third of a larger tablet that may once have carried roughly 260 lines. The museum record notes that it joins with another fragment, CBS 100867, and that the preserved passages speak not only of a flood, but of creation and of cities, and of divine decisions that seem to arrive already formed, like instructions retrieved from somewhere older than the moment of writing. If you're listening to this as you settle down, on a bed, on a couch, or in the quiet corner of a late shift, take a moment now to comment where you're listening from. A city, a country, even a single word. It places a living voice beside these silent ones, and it reminds us that this investigation is not about winning an argument, but about listening carefully. CBS 10673 is not large. The Penn Museum record gives its length as about 13.3 centimetres, its width about 10.16 centimetres, and its thickness about 1.9 centimetres, dimensions that feel almost intimate, like a small tile that could warm in your palm. And yet it holds a world. It speaks of divine instructions to humanity, including the building of cities under the protectorship of specific deities, Eridu among them, linked in the museum description to Ea, the god of water, known in Sumerian contexts as Enki. It also speaks of a decision to destroy humankind by flood, and of a figure named Ziusudra, presented as a king, who receives warning and survives by building a boat. The museum description notes that the storm lasts 7 days and 7 nights before the sun returns, and that sacrifice follows survival, and that the gods An and Enlil grant Ziusudra eternal life. These are famous themes, and that familiarity is part of the danger. When we hear a flood story, we tend to slot it into a single mental drawer: myth, memory, moral. But the clay itself resists that simplification. It is not a story told for entertainment. It is a record written in columns with the visual discipline of an archive. It belongs to a world where scribes copied and recopied what mattered, and where the act of writing could be a kind of preservation against erasure. The CDLI, what scholars call the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, lists this very artifact under its own identifier, P265876, and classifies it as a literary witness to the Sumerian flood story tradition. In that database entry, it is also explicitly tied to Nippur as provenience, and to the Penn Museum as its collection. So even before we interpret a single line, we can say with certainty that we are dealing with a real object, from a real site, curated in a real institution, and integrated into a modern scholarly record. And yet the tablet is fragmentary. It is, in the Penn Museum's own words, the lower third. That means the beginning is missing. The upper sections, the opening logic, the framing lines, the parts that might have explained why things begin the way they do, are gone. Whatever was written above, it has been physically erased by time, broken away from us in antiquity or in the long centuries after. This is where the title begins to feel less like a provocation and more like a methodological question. If a text already speaks of creation and of pre-flood kingship and of divine instruction, and then it breaks, leaving us with a surviving lower portion, what else might have been present in the missing upper body of the tablet? What earlier assumptions, what prior conditions, what first attempts at order might once have been stated plainly before the clay snapped and the lines vanished. The mainstream scholarly approach is careful here. It treats this tablet as part of a tradition of flood literature, a Sumerian narrative that shares themes with later Akkadian versions, Atrahasis, and the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It reads the creation material as a known mythic framework. The gods establish human society, assign cities and cults, and then decide to wipe humanity out, only to be resisted by a god who warns a human survivor. This is a coherent interpretation, and it fits the broad family of Mesopotamian primeval narratives, but there is a quieter detail embedded in the Penn Museum's own description that deserves to be handled like a fragile thing. The text deals with the creation of humans and also with pre-Diluvian cities and their rulers. That ordering matters. Creation, then cities, then rulers, and only then the flood. That sequence can be read as a simple mythic timeline, but it can also be read as an administrative memory, a society imagining itself as the restoration of something that existed before disaster. The text, as preserved, does not sound like invention, it sounds like inheritance. And inheritance raises a different question than invention does. If the Sumerians framed themselves as recipients of kingship, of rights, of city plans, of how things should be, then what were they receiving? A set of instructions, a remembered pattern, a template. Now consider the title again, created twice, the first erased. The flood is, in story terms, destruction, but in archival terms, the flood is also a boundary line. The Ashmolean Museum's description of the Sumerian king list on the World Blundell Prism, AN 1923-444, captures the same hinge in a single, almost formulaic phrase: the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven. That object, housed in Oxford, is a separate artefact from a separate tradition, but it preserves the same conceptual theme. Before the flood, one order; after the flood, another order. And the Penn Museum tablet, CBS 10673, sits inside that seam like a broken nail holding two planks together. It tells us that the Sumerians could imagine a world before the flood with cities already named and assigned, and with rulers already present, and with humanity already created. It tells us too that a divine decision could be made to destroy the seed of mankind, and that survival could be engineered through warning and construction. In the language of the title, we might call that a reset. But the question we are going to hold quietly, without forcing it, is whether Mesopotamian texts preserve not just one reset, but the memory of repeated resets. Not just one creation of humans, but more than one model of how humans come to be. Because when a culture stores multiple creation models side by side, humans fashioned from clay, humans produced as labour substitutes, humans emerging when a tool strikes the earth, it may be preserving competing explanations, or it may be preserving layers, and layers are what archaeologists live with. The clay in CBS 1673 is not trying to convince you of anything. It cannot. It is too old, too broken, too indifferent. It simply remains. It holds the remnants of a story that begins somewhere above the surviving lines, in a part we cannot touch. So in this first quiet chapter, we do not decide what happened. We do something slower. We place our fingertips near the edge of the break and admit what is missing. If there was a first version of humanity, if there was an earlier attempt, a less stable or less enduring kind of people, then the most likely place to glimpse it would not be in a sensational claim, but in a fracture, in a missing opening, in a tradition where the flood does not merely destroy bodies, but also edits memory. And when a record begins after the beginning, the mind naturally wonders what the beginning said, when kingship came down before people were ready. There is a particular kind of sentence that appears in Mesopotamian tradition like a seal impression, pressed so firmly, repeated so often, that it begins to feel less like poetry and more like procedure. On a tall clay prism in Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum's Sumerian king list, accession AN 19-23444, the opening line in Sumerian is preserved in cuneiform as a formula Namlugalante 11-3 when kingship had descended from heaven. The CDLI catalogues this same object as P384786 and places it in the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1900 to 1600 BC. The same broad era that also produced the Penn Museum's flood narrative tablet we held in the mind last chapter. The prism is not a tablet you hold like a letter. It is a column you would rotate, reading down each face as though turning a slow, heavy thought in your hands. And the first thought it offers is not about agriculture or families or local chiefs. It begins above humanity in a vertical direction. Kingship comes down. The Ashmoleans' own description of the prism says that the list is not history in the modern sense, but a blend of myth, legend, and historical information. And it highlights a hinge line that sounds almost like a clerk closing a ledger the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven. In other words, the flood is treated as a dividing mark, and kingship is treated as something that can be placed, removed, and placed again. That is already an unsettling way to talk about political authority. It implies kingship is not invented by human society, not negotiated at the riverbank, not won by strength alone. It is lowered, it arrives, it is granted. Mainstream scholarship typically reads this as a theological claim, a way for later rulers, particularly those connected with dynasties like Essene, as the Ashmolean explanation suggests, to legitimize their authority by embedding it inside a cosmic order. That interpretation is steady and reasonable. A king list, in this view, is propaganda with a sacred accent. It shows that power has always moved city to city by divine decision, and therefore the current holder of kingship is part of an ordained sequence. But propaganda, even when it is propaganda, still preserves the shape of what a society thinks is believable. It preserves the boundaries of plausibility. If a scribe chooses to say, kingship descended from heaven, it is because that kind of statement lands inside the cultural ear as a meaningful explanation, not nonsense. And that raises a quiet question that fits our core investigation. If kingship is something that can descend, an office lowered into the world, then what precisely is it descending into? The Sumerian king list does not begin with ordinary reigns. It begins with reigns so long they stop behaving like biography and begin behaving like geology. The earliest rulers in the list are given reign lengths measured in vast stylized numbers. The Seedley transliteration of P384786 preserves those opening city names: Eridu, then Badtibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shurpak, written as if these places were not founded by humans but assigned to them. Mainstream interpretation treats the extraordinary reign lengths as mythical or schematic. Many scholars understand them as part of a literary strategy. The before time is stretched, the after time compresses, and the shift helps the text signal the approach of the flood boundary. The Ashmolean description itself notes exactly this pattern. As the list reaches later, historically attested rulers' reign lengths become more realistic. But there is an overlooked detail hiding inside that very observation. A text that wants to declare this is, myth could simply begin with the gods and stay with the gods. Instead, this list begins with kings, cities and reigns, human institutions, only magnified beyond the scale of normal human life. It is as if the text is remembering something like society, something like governance, but in a distorted time field, and distortion is one of the classic signs of a long memory being carried forward through generations. Not proof, not certainty, just a recognizable pattern. When a story is repeated for a very long time, some elements become symbolic and swollen, but the skeleton of sequence remains. If we allow ourselves to hold that possibility softly, without turning it into a conclusion, then kingship descended from heaven begins to sound less like a metaphor and more like a statement of origin, the institution did not arise from the people. The people were arranged around an institution that pre-existed them. Now, in the title of this film, the Anunnaki are the ones associated with creation. The term itself is slippery, and it changes by period and by genre. A reference work as conservative as Encyclopaedia Britannica notes that the meaning and membership of the Anunnaki vary across the limited texts recovered, and that their functions shift, sometimes heavenly, sometimes underworld, sometimes as judges, sometimes as fate deciders. That is not a fringe point. It is the mainstream caution. The category is fluid. So when we speak the word Anunnaki in this script, we do it as a textual context, not as a fixed caste list. It is a label that ancient writers used in different ways, and that modern scholars must handle with care. Still, a stable thread does exist. In Sumerian literature, the Anunna, closely related as a term group to later Anunnaki usage, appear as a collective who take part in decisions, allotments and destinies. In the Sumerian myth known as Enki and the world order, Enki is even called the leader of the Anunna gods, and the text imagines the organisation of cities and roles as something decreed, allocated, placed into proper compartments. If that is how the cosmos is framed, roles descending, offices assigned, destinies decided, then the creation of humanity begins to look less like a single moment and more like an administrative act, a solution, a deployment. This is where the idea of created twice can enter the discussion without forcing itself into the evidence, because if kingship can descend more than once, if it can exist before a flood and then descend again after, then the world in Mesopotamian imagination is capable of being rebooted without losing its core institutions. The city names return, the concept of kingship returns, the office returns. That invites an alternative possibility, stated only as a what if. What if the Sumerian king list is not merely saying, we once believed in divine kingship, but is preserving the sense that human society has been reorganized more than once, first around an earlier order that is now unreachable, and then around a later order that is remembered as restoration? What if after the flood is not just after water, but after a deliberate clearing of a prior arrangement? The problems with this alternative reading are real, and they should be spoken plainly. A king list is a stylized genre. It compresses centuries and expands others. It is not written as a diary. Its purpose is ideological as much as historical. It is also preserved in copies, meaning we are looking at a tradition, not at a single original composition. But the strength of the alternative reading is also real. It matches the way other Mesopotamian texts treat catastrophe and renewal, not as a random tragedy, but as a cosmic policy decision followed by reinstallation. In the Ashmolean's own description, the line about the flood and the descent of kingship is presented almost like a liturgical refrain. It is not a moment of emotion. It is a structural marker, and structure is where scribes hide their deepest assumptions. On the prism, kingship is the first thing that matters. Not love, not childhood, not ordinary daily life. Kingship is the opening, kingship is the frame. If we set that beside the Penn Museum's flood tablet, CBS 1673, where the museum description explicitly mentions pre-flood cities and their rulers, and then the flood, and then survival and renewed order, we begin to see a consistent pattern across separate artefacts held in separate collections. Human life is narrated as something that exists under a prior architecture of decisions. In that architecture, created does not have to mean first time ever. It can also mean brought into proper function. It can mean made fit for a role. It can mean reissued. And if humanity can be made fit, if it can be shaped to carry baskets, to build cities, to maintain temples, then it is at least thinkable that a previous version could have existed that was not fit, not stable, not sustainable, a first draft, not in the sense of a modern laboratory, but in the sense of a world that did not hold its shape. The prism does not say that. It does not confess it. It simply begins with a descent. And tonight, as we let the mind slow, that descent is enough. Because once you accept the premise that order comes down from above, you begin to wonder what happens to the world when the order is lifted away, and what must be created or recreated to receive it again. The workload of the gods, the birth of a substitute. In the Sumerian imagination, creation is rarely a sudden burst of light. More often it is a sound, a complaint, a rhythm of labour that becomes unbearable. In the translation preserved by the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, the composition known as Enki and Ninmah opens in a world that already exists, but does not yet function smoothly. The text repeats its, in those days, phrases like a slow drumbeat, returning again and again to the same beginning, as though trying to remember how order was first assembled. And in that remembered beginning, the gods themselves are working, digging canals, dredging clay, piling up silt, until they begin to weep and complain about their life. That is the scene as the ECSL translation gives it in Enki and Ninmah, a composition scholars catalogue as ECSL 1.1.2. In that opening, the gods are not distant architects. They are tired bodies. They are hands in mud. And the first reason to make a human is not curiosity or love, it is relief. Mainstream academic interpretation tends to treat this as a mythological explanation for social reality. The world of early Mesopotamia was a world of irrigation, of canals, of basket carrying, of relentless maintenance against silt and salt and flood. In that context, a narrative where the gods themselves once had to do the digging and then created humans to take over the baskets can be read as a sacred mirror held up to agricultural life. It frames labour as cosmically necessary, and it frames human work as participation in a divine economy. This is not an exotic reading. It is the standard way scholars approach these texts, as cultural explanation, as theological reflection, as literature shaped by lived experience. But Enki and Ninmah contains details that complicate a purely symbolic reading. The text does not simply say humans were created. It describes a procedure. It gives instructions. It names a location. It names substances. It names a division of roles among divine figures, as though creation is not a unique miracle, but a craft that can be repeated if the right steps are followed. Nama, described as the primeval mother who gave birth to the senior gods, goes to wake Enki, who is lying asleep in the deep Enga, the flowing water, a hidden place whose interior no other god knows. The translation lingers on the sleep, Enki not waking, not rising, until the complaint forces him into motion. Then, in a line that feels oddly human for a divine being, Enki slaps his thigh in annoyance and begins to plan. That moment is in the ECSL translation, the god of wisdom stirred awake, not by thunder, but by bureaucracy, by the need to solve a workload problem. And then comes the craft language. Enki instructs that clay be taken from the top of the Abzu, the freshwater deep, kneaded and pinched off by birth goddesses, shaped into a form, and then assigned a destiny. Ninmah is named as an assistant in this work. Several other birth goddesses are mentioned as standing by, and the purpose is explicit. Create a substitute for the gods so that they can be freed from their toil and impose on him the work of carrying baskets. That is the ECSL translation again, still calm, still methodical, still insistent that the point of the human is function. When we speak about the Anunnaki in connection with creation, this is part of the textual background. Enki and Ninmah uses the term Anunna, closely related in later traditions to Anunnaki group language, as part of its opening cosmic setting, saying that the Anunna gods were born. It is not presenting them as outsiders, it presents them as a class within the divine world, already present when fates are being determined. At this stage, the mainstream view and the text itself align. Humans are introduced as a solution to divine labour. But now the story turns, and the tone changes in a way that matters for our investigation. After the initial creation, there is a feast, there is beer, there is celebration, and then there is a contest, a kind of philosophical game that becomes darker the longer you listen. Ninmah declares that a human body can be good or bad, and that she can decide fates by her will. Enki responds that he will counterbalance whatever fate she decides. Then Ninmah fashions a series of humans with impairments, weak hands, damaged feet, inability to hold urine, inability to give birth, ambiguous sex, and Enki decrees a place for each within society. This section has often been read by scholars as a mythic exploration of disability and social role, a way to imagine that even those with limitations have a place decreed within the order of the city. It can also be read as a story about limits, how far divine power can go, and how fate is assigned. But there is another layer here that deserves attention. The text does not treat human as a single fixed product. It treats human as a category within which variation can be made, assessed, and assigned. In other words, it treats humanity as something adjustable, something that can be shaped differently, evaluated, placed. And then Enki makes his own creation Umul, described in the translation as neither fully alive nor fully dead, unable to speak, unable to support itself. Ninmah cannot assign it a workable fate. The contest ends with Ninmah unable to rival Enki, and Enki's praise being called sweet. This is often approached as humour, as satire, as theology, but the sequence itself, creation, then variation, then a failed or ambiguous specimen, carries a quiet implication. If the divine world can form multiple types of humans, and if at least one of those forms is declared unworkable, then the text is preserving the concept of iteration. Not one creation, but many attempts, and not every attempt successful. This does not prove that humans were created twice, but it shows that the idea of making humanity is not framed as a single unrepeatable act. It is framed as a process subject to adjustment and constraint. That alone changes the temperature of the title. It makes created twice feel less like an imposed fantasy and more like a question that could arise naturally from the logic of the text. Now, a careful mainstream objection appears here, and it must be honoured. A myth can speak in this way without preserving literal history. It can use the language of craft to express symbolic truth. It can present disabled bodies as narrative devices. It can exaggerate divine agency to explain social structures. All of that is possible, and in many academic contexts, it is the preferred explanation. So, what is the specific problem with the mainstream view? What detail does it sometimes overlook? It is the way these texts repeatedly describe civilization, not as something humans build upward, but as something gods arrange downward, not as invention, but as assignment. In Enki and Ninmah, the first human's destiny is assigned immediately. In the Sumerian king list tradition, kingship descends, and then cities receive rulers. In the Penn Museum's flood tablet description, divine instructions include the building of cities under named deities, and then a decision is made about the seed of mankind. Across these sources, humanity is consistently treated as the managed element inside a system that already has offices, duties, and thresholds. So here is the speculative possibility, stated at low confidence, exactly as a responsible reading should state it. What if the earliest Mesopotamian memory is not of humans inventing civilization, but of humans being fitted into a civilization pattern that was already present, an inherited template? And if that is the case, then what if a first human condition existed that did not fit well enough, did not stabilize well enough, and required a second, more workable issuance? In the logic of Enki and Ninmah, the first requirement of a human is to carry baskets, not to wonder, not to dream, not to govern, to carry. If there had been a first version of humanity, if there had been an earlier people who were not suited to the workload, or who were not sustainable within the divine plan, then the most natural way for a Mesopotamian scribe to speak about it would not be in the language of failure as we would use it. It would be in the language of function. This form cannot bear the work, cannot hold its place, cannot be assigned a destiny that keeps the system running. And once you start listening for that language, function, assignment, destiny, its presence becomes hard to ignore. The Slee preserves concrete witnesses to these literary traditions as physical objects, not just as ideas. For example, Slee artifact P260907, a Nippur tablet in the Penn Museum collection, is catalogued as a witness to Enki and the World Order, another Enki-centered composition that speaks directly about decreeing fates and organising the world. And while that is not the same composition as Enki and Ninmah, it sits within the same scribal environment where Enki's role is repeatedly framed as planner, organiser, fate decreer. So within the world of these texts, creation is not a single thunderclap. It is administration. It is crafting. It is the allocation of duties. It is the attempt to make a living being that can hold a place inside a pre-existing structure. And that is why the title's idea, created twice, the first erased, does not need to arrive with spectacle. It can arrive like a slow recognition that these traditions already imagined humanity as something shaped to purpose, and that shaping implies the possibility of reshaping. A small, quiet thought follows from that. If humans were made as a substitute, and if substitute making can be adjusted, then the line between creation and recreation may be thinner than we usually assume, and somewhere in the broken spaces of the tablets, above missing lines, between duplicate copies, across flood boundaries, there may be room for a first attempt that no longer stands in full view, but still leaves its fingerprint in the clay. The flood is a redaction, what survives, what vanishes. A flood, in the imagination of the ancient scribes, is not only water, it is also a line drawn through time. On the Penn Museum's flood tablet, CBS 10673, the surviving portion is described as the lower third of a larger work, with 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, each preserved column holding perhaps 10 to 15 lines, while the complete tablet may once have contained around 260 lines. The museum description states, with a kind of calm precision, that the text deals with the creation of humans, with pre-flood cities and their rulers, and then with the flood itself. It is the structure of a world that is built, administered, and then deliberately unmade before it is allowed to begin again, altered by what it has passed through. What matters for our question is that this is not presented as chaos. It is presented as policy. The museum description of CBS 10673 says that Enki reveals the god's plan to destroy the human race by means of a flood to Ziusudra, described as a king, urging him to heed advice. Wind and storms arrive, the flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights, the sun returns, Ziusudra leaves the boat, and sacrifices are offered. Then An-Enlil grants Ziusudra eternal life. The language here is not emotional, it is procedural. A decision is made, an action follows, a remainder is preserved, and then a new status is granted. If you listen to that structure with the ear of an archaeologist, it begins to resemble something more familiar than myth. It begins to resemble redaction. A redaction is what happens when a text is edited, when portions are removed, reordered, preserved selectively, and then copied forward as if the remaining version is the whole. In scribal culture, redaction can be intentional, or it can be accidental, or it can be the consequence of violence and loss. But the effect is the same. A tradition continues, and yet something earlier is missing, and the missing pieces change what the surviving lines can mean. The flood functions like that, not just in the story, but in the way the story is preserved, because a flood does not erase evenly. It leaves pockets, it leaves survivals. It creates a world where certain things remain above the mudline, while others are sealed under it. And in that sense, a flood is not only destruction, it is selection. That selection appears again in another artifact that sits far from Philadelphia, in Oxford. On the Ashmolean Museum's Sumerian king list prism, An 923.444, the museum description emphasises the hinge phrase, "the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven. That sentence is not told like a tragedy, it is told like a boundary marker. Before the flood, one sequence of kings. After the flood, another sequence, shorter reigns, more recognisable cities, a shift toward what later scribes would treat as historical time. So across two separate objects, CBS 1673 in the Penn Museum and AN 193.444 in the Ashmolean, the flood functions the same way as a cut in the archive. Mainstream scholarship is very comfortable with that idea in literary terms. It treats the flood boundary as mythic time, giving way to historical time. It treats the antediluvian reigns as schematic, and the post-diluvian dynasties as increasingly realistic. It treats the flood as a narrative device that separates then from now, legitimizing the present by framing it as the orderly successor of a prior half-legendary world. But there is a specific problem that sometimes slips past even that careful reading. If the flood is a narrative boundary that helps later scribes make sense of time, then it is also a mechanism by which earlier material can be safely placed beyond verification. Anything attributed to the before side is, by definition, inaccessible. It can be written about with confidence because no one can go back and check it. That is not an accusation. It is an observation about how boundary myths behave. And it means that if there ever were traces of an earlier human condition, something like a first creation, later replaced, then placing it before the flood would be one of the most effective ways to preserve the memory while also protecting the present from the details. In other words, the flood is not only the eraser, it is the hiding place. CBS 1673 itself gives us a physical analogy for this, because the artefact is broken. The Penn Museum description calls it the lower third, the upper portion is missing. Even in our hands, even in modern climate control, the tablet has undergone its own redaction through fracture. We inherit a surviving section, and the missing section becomes a silence that shapes our reading. That silence matters, because the preserved portion, even as described in the museum record, already contains multiple layers: creation instructions, city foundations under named deities, kingship and rulership before the flood, the divine decision to destroy, and then survival and reward. It is not one simple story. It is a compression of phases, and when phases are compressed, interpretation becomes delicate. We have to ask which phase is being remembered as foundational and which is being remembered as corrective. There is a quiet detail in the Penn Museum description of CBS 10673 that is easy to glide over because it sounds familiar. The passage where divine instructions include the building of cities under the protectorship of specific deities, with 5 city names preserved, including Eridu, linked, there to Ea, the god of water. That detail implies a world where urban order is not an accident of human settlement. It is a prescription. Cities are assigned, and by implication, the humans who live in them are assigned as well. Mainstream interpretation would usually see this as etiological, an origin story explaining why particular cities have particular patron gods and temples. That fits well with what we know about Mesopotamian city religion. But the overlooked detail is this: the text, as the museum summarises it, places that city assignment instruction in the same narrative body as the creation of humans and the flood decision. That combination is not required. A flood story could begin with human noise, or with divine anger, or with a heroic warning. Instead, this tradition embeds the flood inside a larger blueprint of civilization. Creation and urban assignment come first, and the flood comes later. So consider, softly, what that sequence could imply if we treat it as remembered administration rather than pure mythic scenery. If a divine blueprint can assign cities and duties, then a flood can function as a reset button that wipes the board clean while leaving the blueprint intact. The cities may be rebuilt, the rites may be reinstalled, kingship may descend again, the human population may be repopulated, And if repopulation is imaginable within the same logic, then repetition becomes imaginable, not certain, simply imaginable. At this point, a cautious reader might object. The text does not explicitly say humans were made twice. It does not clearly speak of an earlier model being replaced by a later one. It speaks of one creation, then destruction, then survival. That is true, and it's important. So the only responsible way to proceed is to ask a narrower question, one that arises naturally from the evidence we have. What does it mean in these traditions for the seed of mankind to be threatened? In the Penn Museum description of CBS 1I673, the God's plan is to destroy the human race by flood. In later Mesopotamian flood traditions, that same idea appears as the destruction of the seed or the line of humanity, as though humanity is being treated not as a set of individuals, but as a continuity that can be preserved or extinguished. The phrase itself, seed, carries biological weight, but also archival weight. Seed is what you keep when you intend to start again, and the decision to keep seed implies that what follows is not a continuation, it is a restart. So the flood becomes more than catastrophe. It becomes a form of selection. A small remainder is preserved to regenerate the larger whole. That is how agriculture works. That is how archives work. That is how dynasties work. A remainder is kept, and the remainder carries the pattern forward. Now we can state the alternative possibility with low confidence, without stepping outside the text's own logic. What if the flood motif in these traditions preserves a memory not only of destruction, but of replacement? What if the human condition after the flood is implicitly different from the one before, because it has been rebuilt under revised constraints, revised expectations, revised relationships between gods and people, revised limits on what humans can become? This would explain why kingship can descend again after the flood, as the Ishmaelians' description of AN 1923.444 notes. It would explain why pre-flood reigns are framed as impossibly long and post-flood reigns as increasingly ordinary, because the reset is not only environmental, it is institutional. The system after the flood is meant to be more stable, more governable, more bounded. And that leads us back to the title, in a way that is quiet and evidence-led. If humans were created twice, the first erased, the flood would be the ideal narrative mechanism to place between the two. It is a story instrument that can destroy bodies and also wash away details, leaving only a curated remainder, just enough to claim continuity, not enough to inspect the earlier version closely. CBS 10I673 is itself a reminder of that dynamic. It is a survivor fragment. It is a remainder. It is what the flood of time has allowed us to keep. And when you hold a remainder in your mind long enough, you begin to feel what it cannot tell you, not as a frustration, but as a method. Because a broken tablet is never only what it says, it is also what it once said and no longer can. Sipper's broken lines, atrahasis, and the recipe of flesh and clay. In southern Mesopotamia, the oldest questions do not always appear in temples first. Sometimes they appear in libraries. Sometimes they appear as broken halves of clay, retrieved from the ground with the quiet patience of excavation, then carried into museum light, where their fractures become part of the meaning. In London, in the British Museum's Middle East collection, there is a clay tablet registered as 1889,426.234 and catalogued as museum number 78941. The museum record describes it plainly: a clay tablet, bottom half preserved, the right upper quarter missing, chipped and surface damaged, a Babylonian story of the flood from Sippar dated to the reign of Amisaduqa with regnal year 12 noted. It is not presented as a myth floating in the air. It is presented as an object with weight and damage, a surviving piece of a larger written body held in the museum's care as a fragment of an old Babylonian tradition. And in that tradition, the making of humans is not merely narrated, it is specified. The broader story, known as atrahasis, is often approached in mainstream scholarship as a classic Mesopotamian explanation for why humans exist and why disasters strike. The gods are burdened, humans are created to bear labour, humans multiply and become noisy, the gods attempt to reduce them through plagues and famine, and finally a flood is sent, with one man warned and preserved. Many scholars treat this as a sophisticated theological reflection on human fragility and the tension between divine order and human abundance. That reading is fair, but the text also contains something more technical than theology, a recipe. It is one of the most striking elements of the atrahasis tradition, and it echoes through later flood narratives like a repeated phrase. The core idea, presented in translations by Assyriologists across the last century, is that humans are formed by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain deity, producing a being that is neither purely divine nor purely earth. It is an act of manufacture, and it is framed as a solution agreed upon by the gods in response to labour and rebellion. The British Museum's BM 78941 is one of the key Old Babylonian tablets tied to this tradition, and its condition matters. The tablet is damaged, incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a minor inconvenience. It is the environment of interpretation. We are always reading atrahasis through gaps, through missing upper corners, through broken edges, through lines that are present on one witness and absent on another. So if our title asks about a first creation being erased, atrahasis gives us a discipline, not to hunt for a single sensational sentence, but to notice where the story is compelled to repeat itself across multiple witnesses, as if the repetition is the part the scribes refuse to lose. In atrahasis, the reason for creating humans is not framed as a celebration of human potential. It begins as a labour crisis. In the broader Mesopotamian mythological vocabulary, the lesser gods, often called the Igigu in Akkadian contexts, are presented as bearing heavy toil under the authority of greater gods, often called the Anunnaki in the same traditions. The Uruk Project's entry on the Igigu describes this relationship explicitly when discussing atrahasis. The great Anunnaki make the Igigu endure the labour, and the result is unrest that leads to the creation of humans as a replacement workforce. Uruk is careful, as scholars are careful, to note that the membership and boundaries of these groups shift and remain partly unclear, yet it still emphasises the structural point. The terms function in the story to express hierarchy, workload and delegated responsibility. That hierarchy matters for our investigation because it frames humanity as something introduced into an already existing system of power. Humans are not born into an empty world. They are inserted into a pre-established order to solve a problem that predates them. Now, mainstream readings usually stop there. They say, this is a mythic explanation for labour, for suffering, for the precariousness of life in a land of canals and floods. They point out how the story echoes social realities, work, dependence, fear of disaster, and how later texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh rework its flood episode. But there is a procedural detail in atrahasis that does something else, and it is easy to miss because it sounds like myth language. The making of humans is framed as repeatable. A recipe implies that the act can be performed more than once, at least in principle. Clay is not a singular substance, it is abundant. Blood, in the story, is obtained through a specific act, sacrifice, slaughter, a divine body taken apart for the creation of another. Whatever we think of that image, symbolically, the story is still describing a procedure with inputs and outputs. And procedure has a particular implication. It creates the possibility of iteration. If humans are made, rather than spontaneously appearing, then the idea of being made again becomes thinkable inside the same logic. This does not mean that atrahasis is evidence that humans were created twice. But it does mean that the Mesopotamian textual imagination is already comfortable with the concept that the human condition is engineered assembled from components, rather than simply granted once and forever. That comfort changes the texture of our question. What if the earliest humans were not the final humans? What if the story of making humanity, as it was preserved and copied, is already a story of adjustments, of attempts to produce a stable workforce that can bear the burden of the world without destroying the world through its own growth? Even within the broader atrahasis tradition, the gods do not merely make humans and walk away. They intervene again and again. They send constraints. They attempt reductions. They regulate. They do not behave as if creation ends the problem. Creation begins it. And that opens a quiet interpretive possibility. Perhaps creation in these traditions is not a single moment, but a category of interventions, an ongoing management of a living population that can become too loud, too numerous, too disruptive to the balance the gods desire. If that is the case, then the idea of a first creation being erased can be approached without drama. Erasure would not necessarily be a deliberate deletion of a previous species. It could be the disappearance of an earlier human arrangement through catastrophe, followed by a reissuance of humanity under stricter terms, limited lifespan, regulated reproduction, tighter kingship, more explicit service obligations. And in the atrahasis logic, those are exactly the kinds of concerns that follow from the story's core tension. The gods want labour. They do not want the consequences of a successful labour force multiplying beyond control. Here, the tablet's provenience becomes part of the atmosphere. Sippar was a city of scribes and temples, a place where written tradition could be curated and recopied. When a story like Atrahasis is preserved there, when it survives in damaged form on objects like BM 78941, it suggests that Mesopotamian scholars treated these narratives not as casual tales, but as knowledge worth keeping. A text that ties human origins to a labour arrangement and ties disaster to the regulation of that arrangement is not only myth, it is also an explanation of why the world feels the way it feels. And if the world feels like a rebuilt thing, as if it has been reset and stabilised after a prior instability, then the story becomes more than a single origin. It becomes a justification for the present. At this point, a responsible reader must again name the strongest counterpoint. The clay and divine blood image may be symbolic. It may express, in mythic terms, the mixture of mortal and divine qualities, or the idea that humans contain an element of the sacred while remaining bound to earth. It may also encode ritual logic, sacrifice as the foundation of life, rather than literal procedure. Those are all mainstream possibilities, and they remain viable. But the alternative possibility, held gently, is that the story preserves memory of a change in the human condition, one that required explanation. If humans once existed in a different form or under a different relationship to the gods, and that form was wiped away, then the surviving tradition would likely compress the transition into an act of manufacture and a flood boundary. We were made to bear the work. We grew. We were cold. Remnants survived. The world began again. And when you read that sequence slowly, it begins to sound less like a single myth and more like a record of repeated governance. Not a conspiracy, not a certainty, a pattern that becomes even more intriguing when we remember that Atrahasis is not the only place where these divine groups appear in a labour hierarchy. The Aurak entry on the Igigu notes that in Atrahasis the Igigu are subordinate to the Anunnaki, and that the creation of humans is the solution to their refusal to carry the toil. That means our title's word Anunnaki has a legitimate textual home here, not as an alien name imported into the story, but as part of the story's own structure of authority. So now, as this chapter settles, we leave BM 78941 resting where it belongs, a broken survivor from Sippar, held in London, carrying the remains of a recipe, and we allow the question to remain quiet, but present. If a recipe exists, it can be used again. And if a flood can function like an editorial line through time, then what came before that line may not be completely gone. It may simply be unreadable, erased in the places where the clay is missing. Nineveh's library and the second version of the same disaster. Some stories do not survive because they are true in the way stone is true. They survive because scribes kept copying them. They survive because, at some point, a library decided a particular sequence of words was worth preserving, worth repeating, worth standardizing, worth placing among thousands of other tablets, as if it belonged to the shape of the world itself. In the ruins of ancient Nineveh, at the mound called Koyunjik, excavators working for the British Museum recovered fragments from the royal library tradition associated with Ashurbanipal. Among these pieces is a tablet catalogued as K3375, widely known by its modern nickname, the Flood Tablet, an Akkadian account of the flood episode within the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. The British Museum identifies it simply as a fragment of a clay tablet Neo-Assyrian in date from Koyunjik, and ties its discovery context to the fieldwork at Nineveh. K3375 is not an old Babylonian original like the Sippar Atrahasis witnesses. It is a later scholarly copy, preserved in a library that treated ancient narratives as a curated inheritance rather than as disposable tales. This difference, library copy versus earlier tradition, is the heart of what we need to notice tonight. Because if a later library preserves a flood story that already existed in earlier forms, then we are not listening to a single event described once. We are listening to a text that has been revised by centuries of copying. We are listening to a disaster that has become canonical. Mainstream scholarship usually frames this as normal scribal transmission. Atrahasis is older in its old Babylonian witnesses. Gilgamesh's flood episode is later in its standard form. The overlap shows literary borrowing and reworking. The flood story, in that view, is a module, an inherited narrative unit that can be placed into different compositions to serve different purposes. In Atrahasis, the flood is one outcome of a long conflict between divine order and human noise. In Gilgamesh, the flood becomes a revelation delivered to a king seeking immortality, as if the deepest lesson of primeval history is now being repurposed as wisdom for a later age. That interpretation is careful and convincing, but there is a detail in the existence of K3375 itself that can be overlooked when we focus too much on what the story means. A library copy implies selection. Not every local version survives into the library. Not every variant becomes official. Not every line is allowed to persist unchanged. A library is a quiet instrument of standardization. It does not always destroy older ideas. Sometimes it simply buries them under the weight of what becomes the version. So when we move from Sippar to Nineveh, from BM 78941 to K3375, we are also moving from a world where multiple witnesses compete to a world where a scholarly tradition begins to settle into a recognized form. And if humanity was created twice, the first erased, this is exactly the sort of environment in which an erasure could happen without anyone calling it an erasure. Not by smashing tablets, by choosing which tablets to copy. In the older Atrahasis tradition, the making of humans is described with a kind of procedural clarity. The divine world is burdened, a solution is debated, a recipe is enacted, and the human being is introduced as a substitute workforce. In the later Gilgamesh tradition, the flood becomes a moral and existential hinge, an account told to Gilgamesh by a survivor figure, so that the flood now functions as a boundary between what can be recovered and what cannot. In other words, the emphasis shifts. The core story remains recognizable, but the center of gravity moves. In Gilgamesh, the listener is not the assembly of gods deciding policy. The listener is a human king confronting the limits of human life. So the disaster is the same, but the purpose is different. And that shift can do something subtle. It can hide the earlier layers. When a story is retold for a new purpose, some details become less necessary. They may still exist in the wider tradition, but they no longer sit in the foreground of the most copied version. Over time, what is not foregrounded becomes what fewer people know. Eventually, it becomes what feels lost, even if fragments still exist elsewhere. This is not speculation about conspiracies. This is ordinary textual history. It is how libraries work. It is also how memory works. K3375, as a Neo-Assyrian library tablet, sits in a tradition where scribes organize knowledge into series, catalogue tablets, and preserved authoritative versions. This is a world where copying is not casual. Copying is a discipline. It is a craft with rules, and rules tend to produce the illusion of permanence. Yet the clay itself undermines that illusion. K3375 is fragmentary. Like CBS 10673, like BM 78941, it survives in broken form. Even the canon arrives to us with missing edges. And those missing edges matter because they remind us of something essential. The standard version is never fully standard. It is always partial. It is always assembled from survivals. So the question becomes methodical. If a later library preserves a flood story in a highly copied form, what earlier details were present in older versions that may not appear as strongly in the later retelling? What conceptual elements were softened, compressed, or redirected as the story's function changed? Mainstream scholarship answers, older creation motifs are still there, but they belong to Atrahasis. Gilgamesh's flood episode is not primarily about creation, but about mortality. That is true. But consider the alternative possibility held at low confidence with the exact caution such a possibility deserves. What if the shift in emphasis from why humans were made to why humans cannot escape death is itself a sign of a deeper transformation remembered in the tradition? What if the flood boundary is not only a natural catastrophe remembered mythically, but also a narrative tool that allows scribes to talk about discontinuity without having to explain it? A flood explains why the world before does not match the world after. It explains why something earlier can be referred to but not recovered. It explains why the first version can vanish while the second version is treated as the only world anyone knows. In the Ashmolean's phrasing on the King List Prism, AN 9923.444, the flood is followed by the descent of kingship again, as if the office can be reinstalled after the reset. In the Penn Museum's CBS Deno 673 description, the flood destroys, but a king survives and is granted eternal life, a strange administrative outcome, as though the system needs at least one living witness from the earlier world to authorize the later world. And in Gilgamesh's K3375 tradition, the survivor's story becomes a lesson delivered to a later king. The disaster is now framed as knowledge transmission, a secret of the past passed forward. This is where the philosophical framework of the film begins to settle into place without strain. What if the Sumerians and their successors preserved knowledge rather than invented it? A library tablet like K3375 is, by definition, preservation. It is the act of taking a story that is older than the copy and choosing to keep it alive. It is a deliberate decision to inherit. An inheritance raises a calm but persistent question. What, precisely, was being inherited across the flood boundary? Not only the story of water, also the idea that the world has been reset, also the idea that certain institutions, kingship, city order, divine labour arrangements, return after catastrophe as if they are part of a deeper template. When a template survives, but the conditions of humanity within it change, the tradition may not call that a second creation. It may simply describe the post-flood world as the world, full stop. The earlier version becomes unreachable not only because of water, but because of the way texts were copied and standardized in later libraries. So K3375 becomes more than a flood story. It becomes a sign of selection, a sign that the flood in Mesopotamian memory was not only endured, it was curated. It was retold in the forms that later ages needed. And when a disaster is curated, what it erases is not only what it destroys, but also what it makes less necessary to say aloud. The Anunna who decide fates, a world ordered after the making. There is a certain kind of calm that settles over Mesopotamian texts once the act of making is complete. Not relief, not celebration. Order. The world, as these compositions describe it, does not simply exist. It is assigned. It is portioned out. It is given overseers. It is set into compartments the way a scribe sets signs into columns, leaving little room for overflow. In the Sumerian composition, known as Enki and the World Order, Enki is praised in language that feels both devotional and administrative. He is called the Lord of Wisdom and Prosperity, and the text frames him as one who decrees destinies, one who regularizes days and months, and one who assigns functions across the land. In the ECSL translation, Enki is described as the leader of the Anunna gods, and the Anunna appear as a collective that stands in prayer and also participates in the world's allocation of roles. That is the texture of the composition, divinity not as chaos, but as governance, spoken in ceremonial voice. A physical witness to this tradition exists as well, because a clay tablet in the Penn Museum's collection, catalogued in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative as P260907 and identified by museum number CBS 04613, is recorded as an Old Babylonian literary tablet from Nippur, explicitly, classified there as an Enkian World Order witness. It is a fragment, like so many of these survivals, yet even its catalogue presence matters. It shows that this ordering is not an abstract idea. It is a text copied on clay in a known scribal environment, preserved and indexed in modern scholarship, and tied to a real provenience at Nippur through the Seedley's record of P260907. Mainstream scholarship typically treats Enki and the World Order as a mythic catalogue of functions, an ideological map explaining why rivers, fields, crafts, temples, borders, and offices exist as they do. In this reading, Enki's ordering is a divine legitimization of Mesopotamian institutions. The myth is not claiming that a god literally appointed every fish inspector and brickmaker. It is expressing how a society experiences its own world as a system that feels older than the people living inside it, and therefore sacred. That interpretation is sensible and it fits the genre. But there is an overlooked detail in the way the text speaks. It does not describe humans inventing their roles, it describes roles waiting to be filled. Enki's voice in the translation is the voice of someone who already holds a storehouse of authority. He speaks as if the arts and crafts and the powers that govern them are transferable objects, things that can be brought from one divine house to another, things that can be handed over, things that can be placed into someone's grasp. In the ECSL translation, Enki even says that his elder brother gathered up the divine powers and placed them in his hand, and that he brought arts and crafts from the Ekur, the house of Enlil, to his own Abzu at Eridug. The myth is imagining knowledge and authority not as spontaneous discoveries, but as inheritances moved between repositories. This is where our core philosophical framework, civilization as preservation rather than invention, finds a natural home, because the text itself keeps pointing to transfer, to placement, to possession, to custody. If these are the terms of the world, then humanity's position becomes clearer. Humans do not stand at the beginning of the system, they stand inside it. And when humans stand inside a system that is already portioned out, it changes how we hear the idea of creation. Creation, here, is not simply the moment when bodies are formed. Creation is also the moment when bodies become legible to the system, when they can be assigned, managed, integrated, given a place where their existence supports the larger order. That is the mainstream reading, but it also contains a quiet problem. If the myth is only an ideological map of institutions, why does it speak so insistently in the language of fate? Why does it return to the act of decreeing destinies and to the idea that a collective of gods, the Anuna, determine what happens in the land? The simplest answer is that destiny language is a theological way of speaking about authority. But there is another possibility, stated carefully at low confidence. What if destiny in these texts is also a memory of constraint? A memory that something about the human condition, lifespan, fertility, obligation, vulnerability, was not simply the way it always had to be, but the way it was set to be after certain decisions were made. In the previous chapters, we saw that creation can be described as a solution to workload. We saw that the flood can act as a boundary line, after which kingship descends again. We saw that later library traditions preserve a standardized version of catastrophe, while earlier witnesses preserve procedural language about how humans were assembled. Now, Enki and the World Order shows us what follows after such an intervention, a world that behaves like an office. It has inspectors of waterways, it has builders and brick moulders, it has deities placed in charge of specific functions, down to the management of fish, reeds, storms, boundaries, and textiles. The text can linger on beauty and abundance, yes, but it also returns repeatedly to assignment, to placing in charge, to decreeing. So consider the title again, but do it gently. What if humans were created twice, and the first was erased? If a second humanity existed, if a later issuance of humans was designed to be stable inside this assigned world, then one of its defining features would be fate, fixed limits, predictable roles, a manageable population living under kingship that can be moved from city to city by divine decision. And in that case, Enki and the World Order might not be describing the dawn of human creativity. It might be describing the dawn of human containment. This is not a claim that can be proven. It is a lens, a way of noticing the tone, because the tone is not the tone of wild beginnings. It is the tone of a system that wants to hold. Even the language of the Abzu in this tradition reinforces that feeling. Enki's Abzu is described as a deep hidden place, and in Enki and Ninmar he sleeps in the deep in Gur until awakened to solve the god's labour problem. The deep waters are not chaos here. They are a reservoir, an interior archive, where knowledge rests until it is called upon. That image fits the wider Mesopotamian intuition. Wisdom is stored, not invented. It is taken out and deployed. If so, then the Anuna who decide fates are not merely mythic characters. They are the narrative expression of a worldview in which the rules of life are imposed from above, and in which the purpose of humanity is to participate in those rules. A modern reference work like Encyclopaedia Britannica describes the Anunnaki as a class of gods with shifting functions across sources, sometimes connected to deciding fates, sometimes cast as judges of the dead, sometimes described as distributed between heaven and earth. This scholarly caution aligns with what we see in the texts. The term is not a single stable identity. It is a flexible category used to speak about collective authority. So we do not need to force the term into a single meaning to proceed. We only need to notice what it consistently does in the stories. It makes the world feel decided. And once the world feels decided, creation begins to look less like a first spark and more like a resetting of parameters. There is a quiet consequence to that. If parameters can be set, they can be reset. If destinies can be decreed, they can be decreed again. And if kingship can descend after a flood boundary, then the human world that receives it may not be the same world that existed before. The text does not shout this. It does not announce it. It simply speaks in the voice of a world that believes it has been arranged. And when you listen to that voice long enough, you start to wonder whether arrangement implies a prior disarrangement, an earlier draft of humanity that did not hold its place inside the system, and therefore did not survive into the ordered version that later scribes copied so carefully. The hoe strikes the ground, and people appear. There is a different kind of creation in Sumerian literature, one that does not begin with a divine recipe, or a debate in an assembly, or a plan spoken into the ear of a king. It begins with a tool, a simple implement, a blade of work material on a handle, a motion repeated until the earth changes. In the Sumerian composition known as the Song of the Hoe, preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ECSL 5.3.1, creation is not described as the mixing of substances in the deep waters of the Abzu. It is described as the establishing of a boundary, the founding of a temple, and the moment when a hoe is struck into the ground, as though the earth itself is being opened to release what has been held back. The translation dwells on the hoe as a sacred object, the instrument by which order is enacted. This is important because it is not merely a variation on the other creation traditions. It is a different logic entirely. In the traditions we have already listened to, humans are fashioned. They are formed to replace divine labour. They are assigned tasks. Even when the language is mythic, it still carries a procedural taste. Clay taken from the Abzu, a substitute imposed with basket work, a decision made to preserve seed through catastrophe. But here, in the Song of the Hoe, the creation of people feels like emergence rather than manufacture. It feels like a surfacing. Mainstream scholarship often reads this composition as a praise poem, an exaltation of agriculture and the tools that make settled life possible. In this view, the hoe is celebrated because agriculture is the foundation of Sumerian civilization. The poem becomes a kind of sacred hymn to the instrument that makes temples, canals, gardens and cities viable. It links the cosmic ordering of the world to the practical acts of digging, planting and building. That reading fits the genre and the mood. A praise poem is meant to elevate what a society depends upon, and in southern Mesopotamia, dependence on irrigation labour is not a minor thing, it is existence. But there is an overlooked detail in the way the poem frames the appearance of humans. It makes people feel as though they belong to the ground itself, as though humanity is not a foreign insertion into nature, but something the earth yields when the correct ritual action is performed. This matters because it creates a strange tension with the other creation models. If humans can be made by divine craft, they are a product. If humans can appear when the hoe strikes the earth, they are a release. The two models are not easily reconciled unless we assume that Sumerian tradition is simply inconsistent, preserving multiple stories without worrying about coherence. And that is the mainstream conclusion many readers accept. Multiple myths, different purposes, no need to harmonise. Yet the title we are investigating invites a different kind of listening. What if multiple creation models are not merely contradictions? What if they are layers? In that case, the Song of the Hoe becomes fascinating because it does not present humanity as a later substitution created to solve a problem among the gods. It presents humanity as something that becomes present at the moment of organising the land, at the moment when boundaries are drawn, when a temple is founded, when the earth is prepared for settlement. In other words, this text ties the appearance of people to the restoration of order, and restoration is the key word. In the Sumerian imagination, order is not always invented. Sometimes it is re-established. Sometimes it is put back into place. Even in texts that celebrate beginnings, there is often a sense that beginnings are not raw, they are arranged. In the translation of the Song of the Hoe, there is a repeated attention to enclosure and definition, gardens encircled, mud walls raised, agreements reached, The poem's world is not created as a wilderness, it is created as a managed space. So here is the methodological question that follows, and it fits our guiding framework without forcing it. If humans appear in connection with the Ho, if people are linked to the act of establishing fields, temples and boundaries, then is this creation describing the invention of humanity, or is it describing the installation of humanity into a landscape that is being reorganized? Because the hoe is not only a farming tool, it is also a builder's tool. It is used to cut irrigation channels, to prepare foundations, to shape clay for bricks. The hoe belongs equally to agriculture and to construction. It is the instrument by which a settlement becomes possible. So if the poem says that people appear as the hoe strikes the ground, it could be describing the moment when a population becomes people in the full social sense, organised, settled, temply centred, bound by agreements and labour. That is still a mainstream friendly reading, not literal sprouting, but social emergence. Humans become a structured community through agriculture. But now consider the alternative possibility held at low confidence. What if this poem preserves a memory of an earlier human condition, one that is not the same as the later manufactured workforce of the Atrahasis logic? What if the first humans, the ones the title imagines as erased, are not described as clay and blood substitutes at all, but as beings whose origin is tied to land itself, to the ground, to emergence, to an older relationship between people and earth? And what if that earlier model became less useful, less controllable, less compatible with the later administrative cosmos, where gods assign roles and decree destinies? In that case, the later second creation would be the engineered version, humans made specifically to carry baskets, to maintain canals, to serve temples, to function within kingship that descends from heaven and moves between cities. A workforce humanity, a fate-bound humanity, while the earlier first creation, preserved in echoes like the Song of the Ho, would be a humanity that belongs more intimately to the land, less manufactured, more emergent, perhaps less easily governed. This is not something the poem states outright, but it is a contrast that the tradition itself allows us to observe, and once you observe it, the title stops sounding like an external invention and begins to sound like a question that rises from inside the corpus. Why do the origins of people look so different depending on which text you listen to? A purely literary answer is that different genres speak differently. A hymn to a tool will naturally describe human origins through that tool. A myth about divine labour will naturally describe human origins as a labour solution. A king list will naturally frame human history through kingship. Each text is shaped by its purpose. That answer is strong. But it leaves another question gently open. Why do so many of these texts frame civilization as something that arrives already patterned, already ordered, already assigned, rather than as something humans discover step by step? If the Song of the Ho places humans at the moment order is installed into the land, then it is still consistent with the larger Mesopotamian intuition the world becomes livable when the correct pattern is put into it. And that is close to our core philosophical framework. What if the Sumerians preserved knowledge rather than invented it? A hoe is a tool. Tools carry knowledge. Tools are memory made visible. They are instructions you can hold. When a culture writes a hymn to a hoe, it is not only praising agriculture, it is praising an inheritance, an art passed down, repeated, stabilised, kept alive. So the hoe becomes, in this text, more than an implement. It becomes a symbol of transmission. And if humanity appears with the hoe, if people emerge at the moment the tool is lifted and struck, then humanity itself begins to look like a transmitted condition, a state that can be installed, a way of being that can be initiated, which means that if there was ever a first version of humanity, if there was ever an earlier condition that did not persist, its disappearance might not have required annihilation. It could have required only a change in the pattern, a different way of ordering the land, a different set of tasks, a different destiny decreed, a different kind of people called forth by a different tool, a different ritual, a different administration. The poem does not insist on this, it does not prove it, it simply gives us a second creation logic, one that is quieter, earthbound, and strangely intimate. And in that intimacy, the title's idea becomes less sharp and more subtle. Perhaps the first creation was not erased by violence alone. Perhaps it was overwritten by civilization itself. Duplicate tablets, duplicate humanity, why copies matter. The most telling evidence in an archive is not always a dramatic line of poetry. Sometimes it is a quiet note in a catalogue. Duplicate. A copy exists elsewhere. A fragment belongs to a series. In the British Museum's record for the small Neo-Assyrian tablet fragment K8526, excavated at Kuyunjik and associated with the library tradition of Ashurbanipal, the description includes a detail that sounds almost bureaucratic. It is part of the fifth tablet of the Epic of Creation, and it is a duplicate of another tablet, K3567. The museum record even preserves the scholarly habit of numbering the series, Enuma Eli, like a controlled set of volumes, as if creation itself must be kept in order, tablet by tablet, line by line. That single word, duplicate, changes how we should hear everything else, because duplication is not an accident of storytelling, it is a discipline of preservation. A scribe does not create a duplicate because the story is entertaining. A scribe creates a duplicate because the text is considered stable knowledge, worth reinscribing, worth standardizing, worth protecting against loss. And once you accept that, you begin to realize something almost unsettling. Mesopotamian myth is often preserved with the seriousness of law, with the redundancy of administration, with the patience of a system that expects time to break things and prepares copies in advance. K8526 is small, only a few centimetres in the British Museum's measurements, yet it carries the weight of that system. It comes from a setting where scribes were not simply collecting stories, they were building a curated inheritance. A library. Mainstream scholarship tends to explain this in straightforward terms. The Enuma Eli tradition was important, copied widely, and preserved in first millennium archives. Duplicates and parallel manuscripts are normal in ancient textual transmission. The surviving tablets represent a fraction of what once existed. K8526 is therefore one witness among many, and its note of being a duplicate reflects the broader reality that texts circulated, were recopied, and sometimes survive in multiple exemplars. That is true. But there is a methodological implication hiding inside that truth. If the act of copying is an act of making something survive, then what does it mean when multiple creation traditions survive side by side? Not merely within one poem, but across multiple compositions. Enki shaping clay in one tradition, humans manufactured as substitutes in another, people emerging with the hoe in another, kingship descending as if the system precedes the people. Mainstream answers tend to say these are different genres and different local traditions, gathered and preserved by scribes who did not demand strict harmonization. The library becomes a container of plurality, and that too is true. But duplication forces another question. When a library makes duplicates, it is not only preserving plurality, it is also defining what counts as preservable. It is shaping what later ages will think the ancient world believed. So if our title asks whether humans were created twice, then the most careful approach is not to hunt for a forbidden sentence that declares it outright. The careful approach is to examine the mechanics of copying and ask what copying does to memory. Copying stabilizes. Copying reduces variation over time. Copying elevates certain versions into the version. Copying, in effect, creates a second life for an idea. And here is where the question becomes surprisingly calm, almost inevitable. If a text about creation is copied and duplicated, the creation it describes becomes repeatable in the imagination, even if it was originally told as a one-time event. because a duplicate is by nature a second instance of the same thing. The clay makes this obvious. A tablet can be duplicated, a story can be duplicated, a ritual can be duplicated, a king list can be duplicated, a flood narrative can be duplicated, and once a culture lives inside duplication, it begins to view the world itself as something that can be reset, recopied, reinstalled. This is not an argument that the Mesopotamians believed humans were literally manufactured twice, like a craftsman making two pots. It is an argument about what scribal culture does to the way a society imagines origins. A society that preserves knowledge by copying begins to experience the past as a series of templates. Templates can be applied again. And we have already seen, across the evidence we have used, that Mesopotamian tradition repeatedly frames civilization as template-like, kingship descends, functions are assigned, destinies are decreed, cities are placed under specific deities, labour is imposed, seed is preserved through. Catastrophe. K8526's duplicate note is therefore not a minor catalogue detail. It is a symbol of a wider logic. Important things must be preserved in more than one copy because the world is unstable. And the world's instability in these traditions is not merely environmental. It is political. It is cosmic. It is moral. It is administrative. Now there is a specific danger here, and it must be named. It is easy to slide from texts are duplicated to events were duplicated, and that would be irresponsible. Scribal duplication does not prove historical repetition, so we do not do that. Instead, we ask a narrower, more disciplined question, one that stays inside what the evidence genuinely supports. If a civilization's core stories about human origins exist in multiple models, and those models are preserved through a culture of duplication, could that preservation be carrying forward layered memories of change? Not proof, not certainty. But consider how the flood functions in the king list tradition, and in the flood narratives, it is a boundary across which order is reinstalled. Consider how creation in Atrahasis functions as a solution to divine labour unrest, implying a designed workforce. Consider how Enki and Ninmah explores variations of human bodies and the assignment of fate. Consider how the Song of the Hoe ties people's appearance to the establishment of agriculture and sacred space. These are not minor variations on one single creation. They are multiple creation logics. And if multiple creation logics exist, there are only a few ways to interpret that. One interpretation is that they are simply different stories, never meant to agree. Another is that they are symbolic expressions of different aspects of human life: labour, agriculture, kingship, mortality. But a third interpretation, held cautiously as one possibility among others, is that these are layers, different memories preserved in different forms, perhaps reflecting different experiences of rupture and restoration. If that third interpretation has any merit, then duplication matters even more, because copying preserves layers without explaining them. A library can store conflicting templates side by side. It can preserve a world that remembers more than one beginning, without forcing the scribes to reconcile the beginnings into a single narrative. In that sense, the first creation could be erased, not by destruction alone, but by being kept as one template among others, gradually less foregrounded, gradually less central, until the later template becomes what most people mean when they say how humans were made. And the second creation would not need a drum roll, it would simply become the standard copy. This is where K8526 returns, small and quiet, holding its duplicate identity like a label tied to a jar. A duplicate exists because loss is expected. And if loss is expected in the archive, then loss is also expected in the world. So the deeper question becomes almost sleep-like in its simplicity. If the Mesopotamians prepared for loss with duplicates of texts, might their stories also reflect a world that has been rebuilt more than once? where humanity itself is something that can be reissued after catastrophe, and where the earlier draft remains only in scattered versions, impartial survivals, in the quiet margins of the library. 3 ways to read an erased first draft. In a museum, you learn quickly that the hardest thing to interpret is not what is present, it is what is absent. A missing edge can change the meaning of an entire object. A broken corner can remove the sentence that explains the sentence you still have. And over time, the absence begins to behave like a presence, quiet, influential, shaping every conclusion you might be tempted to make. So now, with the evidence resting around us like clay placed carefully on felt, we arrive at the moment where interpretation matters more than accumulation. Not a summary, not a retelling, a way of reading. There are at least 3 disciplined ways to read the pattern we have been tracing. The repeated sense of resets, of reinstallation, of templates preserved across catastrophe, and each way can be held without forcing the others to disappear. The first way is the simplest. It says, these are myths. In this view, the flood is a mythic boundary used to separate an imagined primeval time from later historical time. The extraordinary rains and the descent of kingship are literary devices. Creation scenes are symbolic explanations for labour and suffering. The gods are narrative figures through which the Sumerians and their successors talked about the pressures of irrigation life, work that never ends, cities that must be maintained, kingship that must be legitimised, and disasters that feel both natural and moral. This reading is strong because it respects the genres. It respects that Enki and Ninmah is a literary composition with humour, argument, and exaggeration, preserved as a text that explores human roles rather than a literal manual of origin. It respects that the Song of the Hoe is a praise poem, elevating agriculture and the sacredness of tools. It respects that a king list is political theology, not objective chronology, and that a library copy like the flood episode preserved in later traditions is part of scribal culture's love of authoritative forms. And yet, if we stop here, something remains difficult. Because even when these texts behave like myth, they still behave like records of a worldview. They still insist again and again that order arrives from above, that kingship can descend, that destinies can be decreed, that roles can be assigned, that humanity can be fitted to function. The mythic reading explains the symbolism, but it does not fully explain the persistent administrative tone. So there is a second way of reading, one that remains fully compatible with mainstream scholarship, but shifts the emphasis. It says, these texts encode wisdom, not in the modern sense of hiding secrets, but in the ancient sense of compressing lived truths into formal patterns. In this view, the creation of humans as basket bearers is a philosophical statement about the burden of life. The flood is a meditation on limits, on cycles of abundance and collapse, on the inevitability of loss. Kingship descending from heaven is a statement about legitimacy, that power must answer to something higher than itself. Duplicates and canonical copies are not clues to conspiracy, but evidence that scribes treated these narratives as instruction bearing tradition, moral, social, ritual. Under this reading, created twice becomes metaphorical without becoming meaningless. Humanity is created once biologically and then created again socially, made into the black-headed people who live by canals, who build cities, who accept kingship, who participate in temple economy. The first human is simply a creature of earth. The second human is a citizen of a divinely ordered system. This reading fits remarkably well with the way the texts speak, because the texts often seem less interested in how bodies first appeared and more interested in how life is organised, how it is stabilised into something that can endure. The emphasis is not on origin as an instant, but on origin as an arrangement. But even this reading runs into a quiet difficulty, because the traditions do not merely talk about social formation. They repeatedly place a catastrophe line between before and after, and they repeatedly talk as though something truly ended and something truly restarted. Even in symbolic reading, the flood behaves like more than a lesson. It behaves like an archival cut. So there is a third way of reading, one that must always be spoken as possibility, never as proof. It says, these texts preserve memory. Not memory in the sense of a modern eyewitness report, but memory in the deep cultural sense, a long inheritance of stories that carry traces of real disruptions, real resets, real shifts in how life was lived. In this reading, the flood is not necessarily a single global event, but a remembered experience of devastating regional flooding that became the master symbol of discontinuity. The antediluvian period becomes the before time, where order existed but is no longer accessible. The post-diluvian time becomes the after time, where order is restored under new constraints. Under this reading, created twice does not require a literal second biological invention of the human body. It could mean a second issuance of humanity as a governed population, human life reorganized after a rupture, repopulated from a remainder, integrated into a system of kingship and temple obligations that is described as descending rather than arising. And that is where the title's phrase, the first was erased, finds its most careful meaning. Erasure would not need to be a deliberate deletion of a previous species. It could be the combined effect of catastrophe and canon. A catastrophe wipes out the earlier arrangement. A canon preserves the later arrangement as the authoritative one. Over time, the earlier arrangement becomes something the texts gesture toward without preserving in full detail, because its tablets break, its lines fragment, its versions become fewer, its place in the copy tradition becomes smaller. This reading draws strength from a specific pattern we can point to without repeating earlier details. Multiple traditions place a boundary line, flood, after which order is reinstalled, and multiple traditions describe order as descending, assigned, decreed. That constellation of themes creates a coherent question. Is the world being described as a first-time invention or as a restoration after disruption? The Ashmolean Museum's description of the Sumerian king list, Prism AN 1923444, states the hinge explicitly, preserving the line that the flood swept over, and that afterward kingship descended from heaven, a framing that treats the flood as a dividing mark, and the return of kingship as a reinstalling of order. But even here, we must stay disciplined. If we choose the memory reading too quickly, we risk turning ambiguity into certainty. We risk treating mythic language as literal fact. We risk forgetting that scribes were artists and theologians as well as archivists. So the most honest position, the one that respects the evidence and the limits at the same time, is to hold all three readings in tension. Myth as a narrative language, wisdom as an encoded social philosophy, memory as a layered inheritance of disruption and restoration. And now, with that tension held, the title's question can be restated in a quieter, more precise form. What if the Mesopotamians preserved more than one beginning? What if the first humanity is not gone because it never existed, but because the surviving textual record is a curated remainder, shaped by breaks in clay and breaks in time, shaped by what libraries chose to copy, shaped by the flood boundary that makes the before world speakable and unreachable at the same time? A clay prism turns slowly in the mind. A tablet fragment rests where it has fallen. A duplicate note in a catalogue reminds us that even the most cherished texts were expected to be lost unless they were copied. And in that world of preservation against loss, it is not strange to imagine that human origins could be remembered as more than one arrangement, one earlier, one later, with the earlier fading at the edges. Not proven, not dismissed, simply left where the evidence naturally leads to the edge of the broken clay, where the first draft might have been written above the surviving lines. If humanity was reissued, what was preserved? Imagine a remainder, not a crowd, not an empire, not even a city, just enough to begin again. In Mesopotamian storytelling, survival is rarely framed as luck. Survival is framed as custody. Something is kept, so that something else can return. On the Penn Museum's flood tablet, CBS 1673 from Nippur, the museum's description preserves a sequence that matters more than any single dramatic line. Divine instructions tied to founding cities under specific deities, the decision to destroy humankind by flood, Enki's warning to Ziusudra, 7 days and 7 nights of storm, and then the moment when sacrifice is offered and Ziusudra is granted eternal life by An and Enlil. In that description, the flood is not just an ending, it is a passage from one administered world to another, with a single human figure carrying continuity across the break. If we treat this as pure myth, then what is preserved is a lesson. The gods can undo what they made, and yet a thread can remain. If we treat this as encoded wisdom, then what is preserved is a model of restraint. Abundance requires limits, noise invites correction, order must be reasserted. But if we allow, only as a possibility, the reading that these traditions preserve memory of resets, of discontinuities, followed by restoration, then the question becomes sharper and quieter at the same time. If humanity was reissued, what was preserved from the first version into the second? Not bodies, patterns. The oldest thing these texts insist upon is not the shape of a skeleton. It is the structure of society, kingship, cities, duties, destiny, the sense that order comes down rather than rises up. The Ashmolean Museum's description of the Sumerian king list, Prism, AN 1923444, makes this pattern explicit when it presents the hinge line, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven. It is almost as if kingship can be put aside and then reinstalled, like a seal that is pressed again onto fresh clay after the previous impression is washed away. And once you see kingship described that way, the idea of creation changes. Creation is not only the beginning of life, creation is also the beginning of a governable world. In Enki and Ninmah, the Atisical translation does not merely say that humans exist, it says that humans are imposed with basket work. It describes clay kneaded from the top of the Abzu and shaped by divine hands, and then it describes destinies being decreed, roles assigned even for bodies that are impaired, as though the first task of the world is to sort life into functions. The creation of humans is presented as an administrative solution to divine labour. In Atrahasis tradition, as preserved in part on the British Museum's Sipper tablet BM 78941, the making of humans is described in later scholarly reconstructions as a recipe, clay mixed with divine substance, framing humanity itself as a crafted compromise designed to stabilise a crisis between divine classes with the workload shifted away from the gods. And in Enki and the World Order, Enki is praised not primarily as a maker of bodies, but as the one who assigns offices, decrees destinies, and apportions the world's functioning so that everything has a keeper. A physical witness to that ordering exists as a Nippur tablet in the Penn Museum's collection, catalogued by the CDLI's P260907, and identified there as a witness to the composition, reminding us that these orders were not just imagined, but written, recopied and preserved in a scribal environment that treated the organisation of the world as something that could be transcribed. So if humanity was reissued, the first thing that seems preserved is the template of governance itself. And that template has a particular flavour. It is not democratic. It is not spontaneous. It is not experimental. It is hierarchical, assigned, fate-driven. Even the flood boundary seems to behave like a system upgrade. The world before is too long-lived, too strange, too loosely bounded. The world after becomes increasingly legible, reign lengths shorten, offices solidify, and life feels more contained. This brings us to the second preserved element, limitation. If you accept the possibility that the post-flood world is an adjusted world, then its most obvious adjustment is constraint. Constraint is what makes administration possible. Constraint is what turns a living population into something a king can count, a temple can feed, a canal system can support. In this sense, the second creation would not need to be described as a second manufacturing event. It could be described as a second set of conditions, new destinies decreed for the black-headed people, new boundaries around lifespan and obligation, new mechanisms to keep the world from becoming too loud, too heavy, too unstable. And then there is a third preserved element, subtler than governance and limitation: knowledge. Not knowledge as discovery, but knowledge as custody. A library tradition, like the one that preserved the Neo-Assyrian flood tablet K3375 from Nineveh, shows how Mesopotamian scribes treated certain narratives as inheritable truth, something to be copied forward, standardized, protected. And the British Museum's K8526 fragment, described as part of Enuma Eli Tablet V and explicitly noted as a duplicate of K3567, shows the same logic in miniature: redundancy as insurance against loss. This is the environment where the phrase "the first was erased" gains its most plausible, least sensational meaning. Erasure, in a scribal world, does not always happen by burning. It happens by selection, by what is copied again and again, by what becomes the authoritative version in the shelves of a raw library. So if there was an earlier human condition, whatever that might mean within these traditions, it could fade without being denied. It could become less central, less quoted, less copied, until it survives only as faint echoes, a different creation model in a hymn, a strange longevity in a king list, a hint of alternative beginnings in fragmentary lines. Under this reading, what is preserved is not the first version itself. What is preserved is the right to begin again, the right to reinstall kingship, the right to rebuild cities under named gods, the right to decree destinies and assign labour, the right to keep a remainder and call it continuity. And that may be the deepest implication of all, that for Mesopotamian tradition, civilization is not primarily invention. It is restoration, a reassembly of a pattern that existed before. So when we ask, softly, if humanity was reissued, what was preserved? The calm answer suggested by the texts is this: the structure was preserved, the offices were preserved, the idea of a template descending from above was preserved, and the cost of preservation may have been the fading of whatever came before, an earlier draft of humanity, not necessarily destroyed in a single moment, but steadily overwritten by the version that could be governed, copied, and carried forward. The quiet shelf where the first version sleeps. The last thing you notice, if you stand long enough near a cuneiform case, is how small the survivors are. Not small in meaning, small in the most literal way. A fragment of baked clay, the lower third of a once larger tablet, its surface arranged into columns that look almost like a city scene from above. On the Penn Museum's description of the flood tablet CBS 1673, the object is described as having 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, with preserved columns of about 10 to 15 lines, and a complete tablet that would probably have carried around 260 lines. The same description notes that it is a fragment, that it joins with CBS 10867, and that it contains a sequence that moves from the creation of humans to pre-flood cities and their rulers, to the flood, to the return of sunlight after 7 days and 7 nights, and to sacrifice and reward. There is something quietly humbling about that. Our grandest questions arrive to us on broken edges. We began with a title that sounds bold when spoken quickly. What if humans were created twice by the Anunnaki and the first was erased? But the longer you sit with the evidence, the less boldness matters, and the more the clay matters, because the clay does not argue, it simply remains in pieces, and the pieces force us into a particular kind of honesty. The Ashmolean Museum's description of the Sumerian king list, Prism AN 1923.444, highlights a hinge line: the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, and it explains that the list begins with mythic origins and fantastically long reigns, then moves toward more realistic reign lengths as it approaches rulers that feel historical. That description also says, plainly, that this list is not history as we would understand it, but a blend of myth, legend, and historical information shaped to legitimize a sequence of power moving from city to city. And yet, even when we accept all of that, the same feeling returns. The past is spoken of as a world that ended, and the present is spoken of as a world that was reinstalled. It is as if the scribes are telling us, without ever needing to shout it, that civilization is a restoration of a template that survived catastrophe. In Enki and Ninmah, the TCSL translation gives us a creation scene that begins not with human aspiration, but with divine fatigue. And it describes clay kneaded from the top of the Abzu and shaped into a substitute who will bear basket work. It also describes variation, multiple human forms fashioned and assigned fates, and it ends with a creation that cannot be assigned a workable place. The text preserves, almost casually, the concept that making humanity is not a single frozen act, but something that can be attempted, modified, judged, and sorted. In Enki and the World Order, the Etziasul translation praises Enki as one who assigns roles and decrees destinies, and it calls him leader of the Anuna gods, framing order as something apportioned and placed. A Nippur witness to that tradition exists as a Penn Museum tablet catalogued in the Sidialai as P260907, recorded there as an old Babylonian literary fragment tied to this composition. Even broken, even partial, it testifies to a scribal world where ordering was a text worth preserving. And in the Atrahasis tradition, represented in the British Museum Sipper tablet BM 78941, registered as 1889,426.34, and described there as a damaged Old Babylonian flood tablet tied to the reign of Amisaduqa, the making of humans is remembered as an engineered solution to a labour crisis, often summarised by scholars as a recipe of clay mixed with divine substance, designed to produce a workforce that can carry the burden the gods reject. The Yorak Project's entry on the Igigu even notes the hierarchical dynamic that drives this creation logic. The Anunnaki set the Igigu to heavy work, the Igigu resist, and humans become the replacement labourer. When you place these traditions side by side, you do not get a single clean answer. You get a shape of discontinuity, a shape of restoration, a shape of knowledge being preserved, copied, and carried forward as if the most important act in human history is not invention, but remembering the pattern well enough to rebuild it. So where does that leave the title? It leaves it on a shelf. Not a literal shelf you can see, but a conceptual one, a quiet place in the archive where we set down what cannot be fully proven and also cannot be fully dismissed. Because the phrase created twice can be read in more than one disciplined way. It can mean two different creation models preserved as literature, each serving a different purpose. It can mean two stages of becoming human, first as a living body, and second as a fate-bound participant in temple, city, and kingship. Or it can mean, as a cautious possibility, that the flood boundary functions like a reset point, and that what came after was not merely a continuation, but an adjusted human condition, humanity reissued under stricter constraints, so that the system could hold. And the first was erased does not need to mean that someone deliberately deleted a chapter of history. It can mean that the first version is what the archive has not allowed us to recover. It can mean that earlier lines broke away. It can mean that older variants were not copied into the most standard forms. It can mean that catastrophe and canon worked together, one destroying, the other selecting, until the earlier draft became a presence we feel only through absence. So tonight, as you let the mind loosen its grip, you do not need to choose a verdict. You can simply notice what the evidence keeps doing. It keeps presenting civilization as something that arrives already patterned. It keeps treating kingship as something that descends. It keeps speaking of destinies decreed. It keeps showing a world where knowledge is stored in the deep places, Abzu, Engur, library shelves, and brought out when the system needs to begin again. And perhaps that is the most sleep-quiet thought of all. That history, in the hands of the Sumerians and their heirs, is not only a record of what happened, it is a record of what was kept. And somewhere beyond the broken edges of CBS 1673, beyond the missing upper portion that time has taken, beyond the flood line that divides before from after, the first version may still sleep, not as a lost certainty, but as a quiet possibility held in the silence above the surviving lines.